going to talk about species. So how do we get so many species? Right? There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of species. And so what has to happen is there has to be genetic isolation of populations. So two populations have to be genetically separate, meaning they're not interbreeding with each other anymore. There's no gene flow in between those two populations. So speciation is when we have two populations that are separated, they evolve separately, and they become two different species. So we use the most common definition: they cannot interbreed to produce viable offspring. So we're going to talk about four different types of speciation. We're going to talk about allopatric, peripatric, parapatric, and sympatric. Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is allopatric speciation. Now, allopatric speciation is a very easy concept to grasp. So it's geographic speciation. It's when you have a single population that gets separated by some geographic formation, like a canyon, a mountain range, a river, and that each of these populations now evolve separately. Right? And over time, they become genetically distinct. So here they cannot interbreed with each other. There's no gene flow in between these populations. And then when or if they ever come back together, they cannot interbreed to produce offspring, so they're two separate species. The next type of speciation, or I'm sorry, this is an example of allopatric speciation. And so this example is of is a porkfish down near Panama. So about 3.5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama, this little land bridge in here, formed. When it did, it separated this one species of porkfish. And so they've evolved separately since then, to the point which now they are two separate species, and that's a geographic isolation. So now we'll move on to the next type of speciation, which is similar to allopatric. It's called peripatric, which is essentially just a type of allopatric speciation, except instead of a population being roughly divided in two, we're looking at a smaller periphery population. So it's a smaller population on the edge that gets separated due to a physical separation, just like the allopatric speciation. Now this can lead to what we call the founder effect. Now the founder effect is when a small part of the population gets separated, but it does not genetically represent the original population. So for example, if you have a big bowl of M&Ms, there's all the different colors in there, you take a handful of the M&Ms. Let's say you happen to, which this can happen, you can happen to do that where most of the M&Ms in your hand are the red M&Ms. Then you take that population of M&Ms, you breed them over here, you get more red M&Ms. I mean, I don't know why you'd be breeding M&Ms, it'd be a little weird. But that population there now does not genetically represent the original population, because it had all those different colors. Now the founder effect can happen, it doesn't always happen when parapatric speciation occurs. It could be that you reach in your hand of M&Ms, you get a ratio of colors that kind of represents the original population. But what can happen is you get a small population that does not accurately represent the population as a whole. So an example of this is the evolution of polar bears. So polar bears evolved from brown bears. So brown bears are a very widespread species all across America. And so a smaller population of brown bears, which were on the periphery, very far north, evolved separately. There was some geographic separation, and they evolved white and larger and into polar bears. And now they are two separate species. Well, there's several species of brown bears, but they are distinct. The next type of speciation is parapatric speciation. And this is when the population is continuous, so there's not a physical barrier that separates in the two populations. So they're one population. However, the ones on the ends cannot interbreed with each other. So here we have this one species that can interbreed with the ones in the middle, and then you can have these ones that interbreed with these ones here, but the blue and the green cannot interbreed with each other. Okay? So an example of peripatric speciation can be represented in a ring species, which is just a type of peripatric speciation. So this is when peripatric speciation happens in a circular formation. So a really cool example, local to here in California, is the Ensatina salamanders. So a long time ago, the original population of salamanders started north and evolved and moved south. Now, right here in the center of California is that big, super dry valley. And salamanders, like all amphibians, generally need wet, moist environments. The center of California is not that. So that separated them. So they evolved separately on each side. And when the two came back together, these two salamanders here, they could no longer interbreed. Even though this one could interbreed with this, and this could interbreed with this, and this could interbreed with this, and this could interbreed with this. So it's continuous. It's a continuous population. These two cannot interbreed. And that's a ring species and an example of peripatric speciation occurring. The last type of speciation is sympatric speciation. And so this is a separation of the population not due to a physical barrier. This is due to genetic polymorphism. So when we have two or more forms of the same species, they may be occupying different niches. Something's happening there that is not due to a physical barrier in which they are separated. So the best way to illustrate sympatric speciation is to show an example. A really well-known example are apple maggot flies. So as you can imagine, an apple maggot fly is a little fly. It lands and it breeds on the apples, and then it lays its eggs in the apples, which hatch into maggots and eat in the apple. Well, what's happened is that there are several different types of apples. There's hawthorn apples and there's domestic apples. In hawthorn apples, so some flies breed and lay eggs on hawthorn apples, and some breed and lay eggs on domestic apples. And so what happens is you get this separation. Even though they all exist in the same geographic area, there's this separation of where they breed. And so what has happened is that the ones that breed and lay eggs on the domestic do not interbreed with the ones that lay and breed on the hawthorn. And so what we're seeing is sympatric speciation in action, because these guys are not interbreeding, even though they live in the same geographic, now occupying two different niches. They're occupying different apples. Now, let's go over these. Let's do a little quick overview. So we have allopatric, peripatric, sympatric, peripatric. Allopatric, geographic barrier. There's a physical separation, which is like peripatric, same thing, except we're isolating a population on the periphery. That's how I always remember it. Peripatric, periphery, right? And then we have parapatric, which is, it's a continuous population, but the ones on the end cannot interbreed. So sympatric is when you have two different forms in the same area, but they're occupying different niches, even though they're in the same geographic